It's October again, and it's time to look at some of the most famous horror movies and their sequels. For the rest of this week, I'll be looking at the classic Frankenstein series produced by Universal Studios. The choice was simple. It's the first long-running horror franchise, it includes 8 films, and it crosses over with the Wolfman and Dracula. So that gives us the most monsters for our madness. The novel Frankenstein by Mary Shelley was written in 1816 and published in 1818. It's been performed on stage and made into a short film by Thomas Edison in 1910. But it was the 1931 Universal film that made it as famous as it is to this day. Even the most minor things were changed. In the novel, Frankenstein's first name is Victor, but in the movie, it's Henry. In the novel, he has a friend named Henry, and in the movie, he has a friend named Victor, so they swapped the names around as if they want it to be as confusing as possible. In the novel, Frankenstein creates a monster without any assistance. The addition of a hunchback servant was something that was only imagined for the movie. Yet it's become a famous cliché. Lots of people assume the servant's name is Igor, but it's actually Fritz. It wasn't until the third film, Son of Frankenstein, when there was a guy named Igor, and then it was spelled with a Y, not an I like most people imagine. I think it may have been the Mel Brooks parody Young Frankenstein that popularized the name Igor and made it synonymous with that of Frankenstein's assistant. Anyway, back to the differences with the novel. In the novel, after Frankenstein gives life to the monster, he is appalled by it and abandons it. In the movie, he's confident in his creation. It's all the other people who hate the monster. I guess it's best I back up and relay the plot. Nothing I'm about to describe happens in the novel. The movie begins in a gloomy cemetery with Frankenstein and Fritz stealing a freshly buried corpse. Next thing, they're cutting down the body of a hanged man. Frankenstein is planning to use the different body parts for his creation. An arm here, a leg there, a dick there, whatever. But it's the brain he's having the most trouble with. Frankenstein's former professor, Dr. Waldman, is teaching a class on the difference between a normal brain and an abnormal one. The class ends, and luckily they just leave the 2 brain specimens sitting there alone. Frankenstein seizes the opportunity and sends Fritz into the room to steal one of them. He goes for the normal brain first, but then drops it like an idiot, and then has to go for the abnormal brain, which is why the monster turns out the way he is. During a severe storm, he prepares to bring his creation to life. Dr. Waldman shows up at his door along with his friend Victor and his fiancée, whom he's been very absent-minded toward. At first, he tries to shoo them away, but decides he might as well let them be witnesses. What you're looking at is the prototype of all mad scientist scenes, and still one of the finest. Who knows what all those electrical gadgets are supposed to do, but who cares? It's a dazzling display of sparks and flashing lights, crackling and buzzing and snapping and popping. Frankenstein's guests think he's out of his mind trying to reanimate a dead body, but he lets them know how serious he is with a cold stare, some stern dialogue, and the crashing of thunder to fill the background, which all complete an ominous atmosphere. With a bolt of lightning, Frankenstein brings the body to life and gets so excited he has to be restrained.
It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
Surprisingly, you never see the monster get up off the table or see his face right away. Instead, you're kept in suspense. 2 scenes later, Frankenstein and Dr. Waldman are discussing the consequences. Waldman thinks he's created a monster, but Frankenstein is still confident. Then, the monster finally shows up by opening a door with his back, moonwalking into the room, slowly turning, and then a series of jump cuts zoom into his death-like face. It's a little strange, but the monster's first appearance here is savored quite nicely. The monster obeys Frankenstein's commands, and everything's under control until Fritz ruins everything. The monster gets angry and has to be confined to a prison cell located somewhere in Frankenstein's lair. Fritz harasses the monster with a whip and torch and ends up getting himself killed. It's not shown on screen, but effective just the same. They have to sedate the monster, and Frankenstein allows Waldman to kill it by dissection, but the monster wakes up, strangles him, runs away, accidentally drowns a girl in a pond, and attacks Frankenstein's wife on their wedding night. This is one thing that bears similarity to the novel. In the novel, the monster kills the wife. At the end of the film, a crowd of angry villagers with burning torches hunt the monster down. Frankenstein confronts his own creation on the top of a hill. The monster drags him to the top of a windmill, and as the tension mounts, the villagers set fire to the windmill. Frankenstein's thrown off like a rag doll, violently hitting one of the sails on his way down. The windmill goes up in flames, and the monster seemingly burns to death. It's one hell of a finale, and must have had audiences in 1931 shitting their pants. It doesn't seem like Dr. Frankenstein would have physically survived, and appropriate that he was destroyed by his own creation. Yet there's a final scene where he's recovering in bed. This ending seems real tacked on if you ask me. When the film first came out, many scenes were cut because they were too shocking back then, such as Fritz torturing the monster. A close-up of a needle going into the monster was removed, even though it was important to the plot because the needle carried a tranquilizer. Then it would seem the monster collapses with no explanation. The censors didn't care if it made sense. They took their scissors to this film without mercy. The scene with the girl was considered too disturbing, so it got cut too, even though the monster doesn't drown the girl on purpose. He thinks that she'll float like one of the dandelions. Despite being excised, it became one of the most famous scenes and imitated in Young Frankenstein. Right after the famous line where Frankenstein says it's alive, he says,
In the name of God, now I know what it feels like to be God.
The censors thought this was sacrilegious, so they removed part of the line. Actually, it was a pretty clever way to block the dialogue with the sounds of thunder. The first time I saw this film, it was the censored version, and there was so much thunder in the scene anyway, I didn't think it sounded out of place. Universal first released the restored version on VHS with all the missing bits intact, with the exception of the God line for some reason. But since then, on DVD, it's been fully restored. Since Universal had just completed Dracula, many of the same actors crossed over to Frankenstein. Edward Van Sloan, who played Dr. Van Helsing, is now playing Dr. Waldman. His acting is so similar, and playing another doctor on top of it makes it seem as if the same character had stepped out of one film into the next. He also gives a disclaimer at the very beginning, warning the audience that what they're about to see is really hardcore, which is pretty comical today. Dwight Frye had played the crazy maniac Renfield in Dracula. Now he's playing Fritz. He's much less insane here, but still offers some nutty mannerisms. We don't really know much about his character's backstory. That's what makes him interesting. He's just some weird guy who helps Frankenstein. There's a part where he's going to answer the door, and he stops for a moment to fix his sock. I don't know why, but I find that really amusing. It's not a flub, there's nothing that defies logic about a character having to fix their sock, but it's also something you don't normally see happen. Naturally, fresh off the success of Dracula, Bela Lugosi was initially chosen for the role of the monster. There seems to be many contradicting stories as to why he didn't play the monster, the most common being that Lugosi refused the role because he didn't like the idea of having his face made unrecognizable through all the makeup and not having any dialogue. And that makes perfect sense. The kind of acting he established in Dracula is completely different than the monster. Other stories say it was director James Whale who wanted Boris Karloff instead. Either way, Whale was attracted to Karloff's face when he saw him in a movie called The Criminal Code. And I think he made a great choice. There's something about Karloff's face that makes him perfect for the monster. Even though Lugosi may have said the role wouldn't take much talent other than to just stagger around and grunt, there's something about Karloff's performance that just works. At the time, he wasn't famous. In fact, he wasn't even credited at the beginning of the movie. It's just a question mark. I believe the reasoning was to make the monster seem more mysterious, but at the end, they do reveal his name. Colin Clive is the real star, playing Frankenstein. He does a great job and really makes the role convincing. Everything he says seems like he believes it 100%. What makes a good mad scientist is that they come off mad to the other characters, but the audience sympathizes with them. We sympathize with Frankenstein. It may not be a perfect film. Some of the acting is extremely exaggerated, like when Fritz is startled by a lab skeleton. The scenes that don't involve Frankenstein or the monster are kind of weak, and there are certain things that don't add up. Like, why doesn't Frankenstein realize the brain he's putting into the monster is an abnormal one? Why does Fritz have an immediate hatred for the monster even though he helped Frankenstein all along without any worry? The rest of the film is nothing short of classic. It's the archetype of its kind. It's beautiful to look at, from the cemetery scene to the laboratory to the hillside. The sound effects fill the atmosphere with constant dread. With the sounds of thunder and the yelling of villagers, you never notice the lack of music. Even if you haven't seen this movie, you may feel as if you have because of all the parodies and imitations. Go to the source, watch the one that started it all, and you'll see it lives up to what you'd expect. Bride of Frankenstein is one of the first horror sequels ever made, and still one of the best. Director James Whale returns and puts on it his stamp of quality. It gives the monster more personality, stays more true to the novel, and completes the story. It does have its tacky moments, like the opening prologue where Mary Shelley, played by Elsa Lanchester, is telling the story of Frankenstein as we recap the first movie leading up to the burning windmill. It's funny how they pretend that's exactly how Mary Shelley's story goes, when really it's nothing like it. But then she continues her story, and that's where Bride of Frankenstein picks up. A man accidentally falls into a water cave beneath the windmill and finds the monster is still alive. It's a creepy scene, and the monster's first appearance is a real doozy. He commits his first murder right away by strangling the man and then throwing his wife down for good measure. This makes the monster seem real threatening and actually lives up to the word monster, but later on he becomes more sympathetic. After he climbs out, he scares the crap out of some other woman. This old squawking crow is Una O'Connor, the same annoying bitch from another James Whale film, The Invisible Man. I have to say, the monster's makeup in this film is great. Props to Jack Pierce for his attention to detail. The monster actually looks like he's been through a fire. Some of his hair is burned away, revealing metal clamps that we never saw before. We assume Frankenstein would have used these to hold the skull together. As the movie goes on, the makeup gradually changes as if the monster's wounds are healing. I also like the fact that he never changes out of those old mangy clothes. There's no need to polish him up, just let him show all the abuse he's been through. Colin Clive is back as Dr. Frankenstein, but the wife is played by a different actress, Mae Clarke in the original, Valerie Hobson in the sequel. Frankenstein no longer wants to pursue his experiments. He's learned his lesson and now wants to enjoy his time with his wife, who he neglected so much in the first movie. This makes way for a new mad scientist, Dr. Pretorius, played by Ernest Thesiger, who wants to work with Frankenstein. He steals the whole show very easily. He's like the devil on Frankenstein's shoulder, pestering him to create another monster. It's no wonder why Frankenstein refuses, but he's fascinated by Dr. Pretorius' own creations. Unlike Frankenstein, who took bodies from graves, Pretorius grew them, all tiny people in jars. The special effects here are amazing for 1935. It may even be the first movie to show tiny people, even before Dr. Cyclops and the Incredible Shrinking Man. Meanwhile, the monster is running around getting bothered and shot at everywhere he goes. He gets tied up to a cross like Jesus Christ and brought to prison. You start to feel sorry for him pretty quickly. The monster escapes into the woods and finds a cabin where there lives an old blind man who he makes friends with. This is a very important scene because the man teaches the monster how to talk. It's both funny and heartwarming. This scene draws its basis from the novel, and it's become famous and again parodied in Young Frankenstein. Tragedy happens when two wandering hunters happen to come across the cabin and find the monster. They could have left well enough alone, but instead they gotta burn the place down. What a couple of dumb shits. The monster storms into a cemetery and finds an underground crypt where Dr. Pretorius is drinking to a skull. He's one sick dude, you gotta love him. He proposes the idea to create a mate for the monster, and the monster likes it. Pretorius shows up at Frankenstein's door with the idea. When he refuses, Pretorius threatens him with the monster. Frankenstein is horrified seeing his own creation and is surprised to hear it talk. Pretorius implies here that he's the one who taught the monster how to speak. It's a lie, as if rubbing it in Frankenstein's face, saying, "Yeah, I have more control over your creation than you do." It perfectly sums up what a cool and cocky sleazeball he is. When Frankenstein refuses again, they kidnap his wife and blackmail him until he has no choice. This is another big part of the novel, where the monster asks Frankenstein to make him a wife. In the novel, Frankenstein goes through with it until the last minute and destroys the creation. Then the monster gets pissed off and kills Frankenstein's own wife, but the movie's take on it is way different. The laboratory spectacle gets into high gear again, with lots of the same pieces of machinery as before, both new ones too. There's another assistant all of a sudden named Carl, played by Dwight Frye. He's the same actor that played the assistant Fritz in the first movie. Obviously they're not the same character because Fritz dies and Carl is not a hunchback. Why they would use the same actor to play the same type of character, I have no idea. What's funny here, the monster gets really impatient and throws Carl off the top of the castle. Well, that's ironic. Karloff throws Carl off. Dwight Frye's been killed by Dracula as well. I guess his characters just can't survive through a movie. Poor Dwight Frye. Might as well call him Fright Die. Wow, I still have a month of Monster Madness ahead of me, and already I'm going cuckoo. The bride comes to life, looking like a mummy at first. Dr. Pretorius announces her as the Bride of Frankenstein. Of course, that's the title of the movie, but it doesn't make any sense because Frankenstein is not the monster's name. I guess he means of Frankenstein, as in the bride is created of Frankenstein? No, that doesn't make any sense either. You know, people have always been so confused since day one, thinking that Frankenstein is the monster. Universal would slap the name over the monster's face, on the trailers, and on the posters. And to top it all off, they pull off this shit saying the Bride of Frankenstein. This is the reason the confusion never went away. There's also a short clip that exists of Boris Karloff playing chess with Bela Lugosi, and Lugosi calls Karloff Frankenstein.
Ready for the test, Dracula? I'm ready, Frankenstein.
The monster is not Frankenstein. I don't know what the deal is. Then they unwrap the bride's bandages and do up her hair. I never understood what the deal is with that weird hairdo. Regardless, the bride has become another famous monster, with the look being imitated constantly all around in Halloween costumes and commercials everywhere. I find that surprising because the bride is only in the movie for a few minutes, and she never comes back in any of the sequels. Also, she doesn't do much other than jerk her head around like a bird, and never speaks other than some hisses and screams. She's played by Elsa Lanchester, the same actress who played Mary Shelley in the prologue, but she's only credited for playing Mary Shelley. For the bride, they just have a question mark, like they did with Karloff in the first movie. Except with Karloff, they reveal his name at the end, whereas the bride, it's always a question mark. The bride simply rejects the monster. She finds him frightening just like everyone else. The monster gently touches her arm, and for a moment you think it's gonna work out, but nope. She screams again, and the monster goes into Plan B. He allows Frankenstein to leave the castle before pulling a self-destruct lever, destroying himself, the bride, Pretorius, and all that remains of the castle. It's a good ending, but my only problem with it is they needed a way for the castle to explode, so there just conveniently happens to be a lever that destroys it all. Why the hell would Frankenstein have a self-destruct lever, especially without any kind of safety lock? What if somebody hit it by accident? Anyway, for a 1930s movie, it's pretty sophisticated, with a dark sense of humor, lots of great camera angles, and a full musical score, whereas the first movie had hardly any music. Giving the monster dialogue and an emotional side really allows Boris Karloff a chance to shine. In many ways, Bride of Frankenstein surpasses the original. It's a masterpiece all the way. Son of Frankenstein marks the beginning of a new cycle of Universal monster movies. After Dracula's Daughter and The Invisible Ray in 1936, Universal stopped making horror films. Then, in 1938, they re-released Dracula and Frankenstein in theaters. It was a big success and proved that monster movies still meant big bucks. So Universal started up the monster engine once again. Of course, this is third in the Frankenstein series. Most horror series by now would be going way downhill. It seems like this would be the case here. Dr. Frankenstein is no longer in it, James Whale is no longer the director, the monster goes back to being a grumbling mute, there's hardly any continuity from the previous films, and there's no more Mary Shelley source material. It sounds like it would be a complete waste, but surprise, it's a first-rate chiller, top of the line. 1939 was a prestigious year for the film industry in general. Wizard of Oz, need I say more. The box office revenue was at a high, and because of this, the budgets got higher as well. Son of Frankenstein shows off some of this cinematic wealth, with extravagant sets, a lavish score, and the longest runtime of any film in the Frankenstein series by far. Most of them were about an hour, 15 minutes or so. This one is an hour and 40 minutes. Originally, it was meant to be filmed in color, but record has it that Jack Pierce couldn't get the monster's makeup to look right in color, so they went back to black and white. The storyline is very simple. It takes place long after the events of the first two films. Frankenstein's son, Wolf Frankenstein, inherits his father's castle and moves in with his family. He's unwelcome by the townspeople because of all the trouble his father's monster has caused. It's as if the whole family name is blacklisted. While checking out the remains of his father's laboratory, he meets Igor, who we've never seen before, but claims to be a former assistant of his father's. Igor is a mysterious undead fiend who somehow survived being hanged as punishment for grave robbing. Now he has a broken neck to show for it. Igor shows Wolf the monster who's been laying in a coma. Igor claims to have been a good friend to the monster and wants Wolf to revive him. Wolf decides to go through with it in hopes to tame the monster and restore honor to the name of Frankenstein. But Igor is the only one who can control the monster and uses him as a weapon of revenge to kill off the jurors who had him hanged. As the body count rises, the sly, wooden-armed Inspector Krogh comes to investigate, interrogating Wolf for much of the film. Eventually, Wolf becomes the hero, shooting Igor and drop-kicking the monster into a pit of burning sulfur, gaining the respect of the townspeople. On paper, this may have looked like an average, run-of-the-mill monster movie plot, but on screen, it's played with elegance and class. Basil Rathbone is our star. He was also famous for playing Sherlock Holmes many times. He's really good as Wolf Frankenstein, he gives the character credibility, you can feel his obsession for his father's work, and his ignorance to what the consequences will be. Igor is played by Bela Lugosi. It's definitely one of his best roles, on par with Dracula, or even better as some say. You can see him as a ringleader of Universal monsters, a crazy old, shaggy, beaten-up lunatic who lives with the dead. The monster is not a central character anymore, which doesn't give Boris Karloff as much to do, especially without any dialogue. But he still plays the part extremely well. His best moment is when we first see him walking about. There's a long, silent period where he stares down Wolf as if he recognizes the similarity with his father, even though he really doesn't look anything like Colin Clive, but that's beside the point. Then he sees himself in a mirror and starts behaving like a territorial animal. Then he slowly realizes it's his own reflection and isn't happy about it. Without any dialogue, you understand exactly what the monster is thinking. This was the last time Karloff played the monster, even though he played a scientist in other Frankenstein films like House of Frankenstein and Frankenstein 1970. He also wore the famous costume and makeup to a baseball game and in a Route 66 episode called A Lizard's Leg and an Owlet's Wing. His decision may have been based on the monster outliving his potential and in how physically demanding it was. He had to wear lead weights, heavy boots, and pounds of makeup. Just the way the monster and Igor are made for one another, so are Karloff and Lugosi. It's one of their best movies together. Lionel Atwill plays Inspector Krogh, again a stellar performance. He's a gray character, he doesn't hate Frankenstein like the townspeople, and he doesn't fully trust him either. He's the mediator between the two. In a creepy monologue, he explains the backstory of his wooden arm, that the monster had it torn off when he was a child. The way he tells it is genuinely bone-chilling, like the best of campfire ghost stories. This was another character spoofed in Young Frankenstein. Dwight Frye is back again for his third character in a Frankenstein film, this time playing a villager. The son of Frankenstein is played by Donnie Dunnigan. Later on, he did the voice of Bambi, the young version. His acting is often criticized, and yeah, he's not very good, but I attest a lot of that to the time. You don't usually see child actors back then doing anything Oscar-worthy. You know who they should have gotten for the role? Gene Wilder. That would have been awesome. He would have been roughly the same age at the time, so it would have worked out perfectly. Of course, the reason I'm thinking about this is because Gene Wilder plays the same role in Young Frankenstein. Yeah, he says he's the grandson. So in other words, that kid is Young Frankenstein. Don't try too hard to connect this movie's storyline with the first two. It almost completely ignores any continuity. Since when did the townspeople start hating Frankenstein? This wasn't apparent in the first two movies in any way. Why is there no mention of the bride? If the monster survived the explosion, why not her too? If the laboratory exploded, why is it standing again? Why does it look so different? Why doesn't the monster speak anymore? Who is Igor? When did he ever help Frankenstein? He wasn't the same character as Fritz. Or wait, maybe he was. Let's think about this. In the first Frankenstein, Fritz was hanged by the monster, but we never see what happened. Maybe it wasn't the monster. Maybe in the amount of time that elapsed since Frankenstein heard the scream and ran to the room, the jury came in, had a trial, and hanged Fritz before changing his name to Igor. Yeah, there you go. You can say this movie is a reboot, or just take into account that lots of time has passed since the last two films. Igor says nothing about the explosion. He says the monster was hit by a bolt of lightning. Also, Krogh's story about how he lost his arm to the monster obviously never happened in the first two movies. And also, Wolf finds 2 bullets in the monster's heart. Even though he had been shot at many times in Bride, he was never explicitly shot anywhere in the chest area. We can assume that happened during Krog's backstory, so really there is a whole episode of the monster that passed, which could have been its own movie. It almost makes you wish there was a lost Frankenstein film that segues between Bride and Son. To sum things up, if you're expecting the monster to be the central character, you'll be disappointed to see him diminished as being Igor's tool. It's the rest of the characters that make it so absorbing. It's all about the three-way battle of wits between Igor, Wolf, and Krog. It's leisurely paced and takes its characters seriously, giving them plenty of time to play off each other. The actors never stand in one place. They move around, throw darts, and do other stage business. The first time I saw it, I thought it was a good sequel, but not as good as the first two. Over the years, it's grown on me, and now it's the one I enjoy watching the most often. It gets better every time, and it's gotten to the point where I think it may even be the best of the bunch. Ghost of Frankenstein picks up right where the last movie left off. The same way Frankenstein and Bride go together, so do Son and Ghost. Wolf Frankenstein and his family had moved out of the Frankenstein castle and left it abandoned. The villagers still see it as an object of bad omen, so they rush to destroy it. Typically, this is how one of these movies would end, so it really starts off fast. Igor still lives in the castle and tries to fend the people off. It's not explained how he survived the bullets from the last movie, but we can assume if he can survive being hanged, he can probably survive being shot too. He's immortal. The castle is blown up till there's nothing left. The explosions free the monster from the hardened sulfur, and the two escape into the night. There's some inconsistency here as the monster is wearing different clothing than before. He's back to his traditional outfit rather than that fur coat he had on in Son. Then the monster gets struck by lightning, which supposedly makes him stronger. This contradicts the last movie where, according to Igor's account, lightning put the monster in a coma. That was why he was lying on the table for half the film. Well, now it makes him stronger? That does make sense because the lightning is what brought the monster to life in the first place, but all these different screenwriters can never agree on one thing. Igor gets the idea to go to Ludwig, the second son of Frankenstein, to get him to harness the powers of electricity to strengthen the monster, or something like that. Ludwig is the first Frankenstein to have the good sense to refuse getting involved with the monster, because of all the trouble it's caused his father and brother. With or without Ludwig's help, the monster goes on a rampage through the town. He's captured by the police once, but gets loose and breaks into Ludwig's house at night, scaring the crap out of his daughter and killing his assistant Dr. Kettering. Ludwig manages to gas the monster to sleep, and then plans on dissecting the monster, destroying him once and for all. He changes his mind when the ghost of his father comes and gives him the idea to give the monster a new brain, because that was the whole problem from the beginning, the abnormal brain. So Ludwig decides to go through with it, but Igor has other plans. While Ludwig is planning to put the brain of Dr. Kettering into the monster's skull, Igor sees to it that it's his own brain instead. He makes a deal with another doctor, Bomar, to swap his brain without Ludwig knowing. His promise to Bomar is that they would rule the world together. How exactly you can rule the world in a monster's body, I am not sure, because you see earlier on the monster can't even fight off a group of police officers. As the finale unfolds, the Igor monster awakes and boasts with power. It's really freaky hearing Igor's voice come out of the monster, and is my favorite part of the film. Soon the monster goes blind. As Ludwig explains, Igor's blood type is different than the monster, and it doesn't feed the sensory nerves, whatever that means. Well, the monster is now blind and angry, throwing Dr. Bomar onto some electrical gear which explodes and sets the whole house on fire. The monster staggers about as everything but the kitchen sink explodes for no reason. You actually see his flesh peeling off, which is pretty nifty. The roof collapses, almost immediately the end credits roll, and you sit there thinking, what the hell did I just watch? This is the first Frankenstein movie without Boris Karloff. The monster is played by Lon Chaney Jr. He was fresh off his success as the Wolfman, so naturally the studio started using him for every one of their monster roles, even if he wasn't right for the part. He played the Mummy and even Count Alucard. His performance as the monster is just as good as playing a rock. He lacks expression and doesn't make one sound. Maybe it's because the monster is supposed to be weak and needs his dose of electricity from Frankenstein. Only when he becomes the Igor monster does he get interesting. Dwight Fry is back again for the fourth time as another villager, and Lionel Atwill is back as Dr. Bomar. They sure do recycle their actors. Sir Cedric Hardwicke is both Ludwig Frankenstein and the ghost of Henry Frankenstein. A shame it wasn't Colin Clive. Evelyn Ankers is Ludwig's daughter, who is also Lon Chaney's love interest in The Wolfman. Bela Lugosi is Igor again, obviously. He's still pretty good, but not quite as creepy as he was in Son. Ghost of Frankenstein is a step below its predecessors in terms of quality, but the fun factor is put on max. The brain transplant idea is really cool. There's lots of action and familiar music cues lifted from The Wolfman. It's entertaining as hell, and we all know hell is pretty damn entertaining. The Wolfman and the Frankenstein monster together in one film. Need I say more? This is the first monster brawl, before King Kong vs. Godzilla, before Alien vs. Predator or Freddy vs. Jason. This was the first Universal monster movie I ever saw. It got me hooked, so I'd say it's a good one to start with. It opens with a spectacular cemetery scene where two grave robbers seek out the tomb of Larry Talbot, the Wolfman. The camera pans to the right, showing off the full scope of this awesome set. They break into the crypt and open the coffin. Unfortunately, they chose the night of a full moon to do it, and apparently the moonlight on Larry's corpse is all it takes to bring him back to life. Larry's body is discovered in the streets and he's brought to a hospital. He tries to explain to the doctors that he turns into a werewolf on each full moon, but they think he's out of his mind. As a sequel to The Wolfman, it's quite good. You see things you never saw in the first movie, like a shot of the full moon, believe it or not, and a close-up of Larry's face turning into the Wolfman. I think the appeal of this effect is knowing how it was done, that Lon Chaney Jr. had to lie still for hours and hours while the makeup was gradually applied. There's also a really creepy moment where the Wolfman stalks a police officer. Larry goes to see Maliva, the gypsy woman from the first movie, played by Maria Ouspenskaya. He asks for her help because he's tired of suffering through his werewolfism. He wants to die again and rest in peace. She tells him that there's a man who can help him, so they go out on a journey to find, guess who? Dr. Frankenstein. Supposedly, Frankenstein holds the secrets of death and can help Larry die. But really, all he has to do is get killed by something silver again, right? Couldn't he just ask Maliva to do it for him and cremate him this time? Well, it doesn't matter anyway, because they find out Frankenstein is dead. The townspeople don't clarify if this is supposed to be Ludwig Frankenstein from the previous film, or if they're talking about the original Henry Frankenstein. All they said is that Frankenstein and the monster died when the castle burned to the ground. Well, that sounds like what happened in the last movie, but what's the deal with the castle? Isn't that the same castle that was destroyed at the beginning of Ghost of Frankenstein? They blew that thing up. Now it's perfectly standing again? Not to mention, the ending of Ghost of Frankenstein took place in the doctor's house. It's the house that burned down, not a castle. The final straw to this mess is when Larry actually finds the monster. Buried in ice! The monster went from fire to fucking ice! You can't get any more opposite than that. I would just say this movie's another reboot, but there is some continuity, or at least there was. Because originally, the monster had a voice and explained that Igor's brain was put into his body and then he went blind, which is exactly what happened in the last movie. But the monster's dialogue was cut, so now there's no explanation that he's blind. You see him staggering all around with his arms out for no apparent reason, and there's some moments where you can still see the monster's mouth moving. I should mention here that the monster is played by Bela Lugosi. Ironic that he was considered for the role in the first Frankenstein. The common story is that Lugosi turned the role down originally, and since then he's regretted it, so this was like his second chance. Everyone's criticized his performance, but the reason it's so awkward is because he's supposed to be blind. Today, when people imitate the monster, they outstretch their arms like that without even realizing it's the Lugosi monster they're imitating. How about that? When people imitate Dracula, it's always the Lugosi Dracula, so it all comes back to Lugosi. Supposedly, the reason for cutting the monster's dialogue was that the studio executives didn't like Lugosi's voice. When they were screening dailies, everyone laughed at hearing the monster speak with a Hungarian accent. I find that hard to believe. At the end of Ghost of Frankenstein, when Igor's brain is in the monster, isn't that Lugosi's voice? Nobody laughed then, and if they did, they wouldn't be laughing anymore now. Also, if the voice was that hysterical, couldn't they just dub over it with someone else's voice? The same way they dubbed Lugosi's voice over Chaney's. According to the original script, the dialogue was extremely confusing. The monster spoke as if he had a split personality, saying things like, "Dr. Frankenstein created this body to be immortal," and "his son gave me a new brain." So is it Igor speaking, or is it the monster? If the original dialogue really sounded that mixed up, then cutting it was for the best. Wouldn't it be great if these lost scenes were found? It's a shame that Universal threw them away. Obviously, back then, no one was thinking about DVD extras. Another thing worth mentioning is the title. It's clear that in the trailer and on the posters, they are most definitely calling the monster Frankenstein. But I do have a theory. Larry meets Frankenstein's daughter, Elsa. She is a Frankenstein, and Larry is the Wolfman, so there you go, Frankenstein meets the Wolfman. By the way, is she supposed to be the daughter of the original Frankenstein or the daughter of Ludwig Frankenstein? It seems as if we're leaning towards Ludwig because of that story about him perishing with the monster when his house or castle burned down. That would make her the same character in Ghost of Frankenstein, who was played by Evelyn Ankers. But Evelyn Ankers was also in The Wolfman, and since this movie is also a sequel to The Wolfman, maybe that's why they couldn't be the same actress. Actually, never mind, it wouldn't have mattered. They recycle actors more than a kindergarten play. It's the 5th Frankenstein movie in a row to have Dwight Frye. It's the 3rd to have Lionel Atwill, who was an inspector, a scientist, and now he's a mayor. Tom Stevenson, the gravedigger who was killed in The Wolfman, is now a grave robber. Lugosi played a character named Bela in The Wolfman, the werewolf that bit Larry Talbot. Of course, he was also Igor, and now he's the monster. Then there's Doris Lloyd and Patrick Knowles, who were in The Wolfman, and now they're the nurse and doctor. I attest a lot of this shameless recycling and lack of continuity to the fact that there was no such thing as home video. Audiences didn't have the chance to rewatch movies to freshen their memories. It could be years between each sequel, but actually I take it back because these movies were coming out rather quickly. But whatever the case, they didn't care as much about continuity as we do today. It's not even clear what time period these movies are supposed to take place. The Wolfman seems like it was set in the present day because there were cars. This one claims to take place 4 years after The Wolfman. But they're back to horse and buggies, and there's a big song and dance scene that looks like something from older times. I do have to comment that this is one of those scenes you either love or hate. I'm really sorry to admit, I think I love it. There's something about it that tickles my funny bone. I guess because it's so unnecessary. The whole movie just takes a break. Time to raise your beer glasses. Okay, where the hell am I now? Oh yeah, alright. Larry's doctor from the hospital catches up with him, and would you know, his name happens to be Dr. Frank. Couldn't they come up with a name that sounded a little different than you-know-who? Well, he agrees to help Larry die, so they go into Frankenstein's old dusty laboratory and strap both Larry and the monster to operating tables. Using Frankenstein's notes, they plan on draining the life energy from both of them. But all in the flash of a second, the Frankenstein curse hits him, and Dr. Frank gets power hungry and wants to see the monster at full strength. So literally, Dr. Frank becomes the Frankenstein of the film. He's punished almost instantly as the monster breaks loose and throws him around. Frank really fucked up because he had to wait till the last possible minute when the full moon was rising. So now he's got 2 monsters to deal with. Just as the monster carries off Elsa, the Wolfman attacks the monster, the 2 of them start fighting, and movie history is made. The monster is much stronger, but the Wolfman is more agile. I like how they balance their skills. Most of what you see here of the monster is played by a stunt double. I wonder how little you actually see of 60-year-old Bela Lugosi. The villagers use dynamite to blow up a dam, flooding and destroying the castle. The 2 monsters perish instantly. So, really? The whole movie has been a suicide quest for Larry Talbot, and all he had to do was drown? Or was it the castle falling on them? Who knows? I think they could have come up with a better way to kill the monsters, but nevertheless, it's a thrilling ending and is an enjoyable monster flick all the way around. The logic is a complete mess, but that only makes it more fun to talk about. The first half, which focuses on the Wolfman, holds itself together much better. After he meets the monster, it goes downhill, until the climax when things get awesome. The opening cemetery scene and the final battle are the 2 highlights which bookend what is an imperfect but entertaining film. House of Frankenstein, now we're talking. This is the first movie to not only team up Frankenstein's monster and the Wolfman, but Dracula too. These are the big three. You see these monsters' likenesses grouped together constantly in the Munsters, Groovy Ghoulies, the Drac Pack, the Monster Squad TV series, the Monster Squad movie, and cereal boxes. But this is the monster mash that started it all. The only thing disappointing is that none of the monsters share the same screen time. Dracula is only in the beginning, Frankenstein's monster only comes alive at the end, and the rest is all about the Wolfman. The main running theme in the Frankenstein films is that there's always some kind of doctor who follows in Frankenstein's experiments. There is Dr. Pretorius, Wolf Frankenstein, Ludwig Frankenstein, Dr. Frank Mannering, and now Dr. Niemann, played by Boris Karloff. The film opens in a jail cell where Niemann and his hunchbacked assistant Daniel are talking about the idea of brain transplanting. Wait a minute, put a human brain into the skull of a dog? Would that fit? And when did Frankenstein ever do interspecies brain transplanting? Whatever the case, they never mention this again for the rest of the movie. Niemann says his brother worked with Frankenstein and passed on his secrets to him. Now, hang on, who was his brother? Could it have been Fritz, Carl, Igor, or maybe even Dr. Pretorius? Who knows? A random bolt of lightning makes the prison explode all of a sudden, conveniently allowing Niemann and Daniel to escape. They meet up with a guy named Lampini who runs a traveling sideshow exhibit featuring the original skeleton of Count Dracula. One glaring bit of inconsistency here is that Lampini says he found the skeleton in Transylvania. We all know Dracula moved to England and that's where he was killed by Van Helsing. Only in the novel does Dracula flee back to Transylvania where he's killed by Quincy Morris and Jonathan Harker. I'd say they were counting the novel as canon, but that's not true either because they say Dracula was killed with a wooden stake, whereas in the novel it was by knives. I guess they couldn't make up their minds if they wanted to follow the book or the movie. Niemann orders Daniel to kill Lampini and takes over his exhibit. No, Niemann doesn't have any real interest in parading Dracula around, he just wants to use it as a cover-up to hide from the police. But when he pulls the stake from Dracula's skeleton, Dracula comes alive again. If that's all it takes, I guess you can say Dracula is truly immortal. What would have happened if the stake fell out by accident, or if it rotted away after many years, or when the skeleton turns to dust, could he still come back? Maybe I'm thinking about it too hard. Well, if you were waiting for Bela Lugosi to appear, you're wrong. I remember how disappointed I was as a kid. Get used to it. Dracula is played by John Carradine, a good actor who I've come to appreciate over the years. But he doesn't have the same magnetic presence that Lugosi had, nor is he as charming and exotic. He plays the part well, but it's nothing too special. Though to be fair, he doesn't get a whole lot of time. Dracula is a slave to Niemann in exchange for keeping his coffin safe, which really underplays Dracula's power. Niemann uses Dracula as a tool of revenge, killing the police officers who sent him to jail, very much the same way as Son of Frankenstein, where Igor used the monster to kill the jurors who had him hanged. Lionel Atwill is in there again as another inspector, his fourth Frankenstein movie in a row. I like how the main characters are out just to have fun. They go to the Chamber of Horrors, they take a walk through the fog, they hitch a carriage ride with some stranger who happens to be Dracula, then they stop somewhere to sit down and have some wine. They just go with the flow like dorm-hopping college students. They set the template for future slasher films. Dracula is killed only 25 minutes in. Dracula's on the run from the cops and is trying to catch up with Niemann and Daniel, who are still using Lampini's horror wagon. They have Dracula's coffin, and they don't want the cops after them too, so Niemann's decision is to dump the coffin, leaving Dracula scrambling to reach it before the sun rises. But it's too late, and Dracula's turned once again to bones. This ends the Dracula story, and never again do we see any of the other characters, except for Niemann and Daniel. It's like a short film before the main feature. Niemann and Daniel travel to Frankenstein's town, and on their way, witness a dancing gypsy girl named Ilana, who Daniel takes an immediate liking to. Her boss takes all her money and beats her. Daniel comes to the rescue and puts him in his place. They take Ilana along for the ride. She's very friendly with Daniel, but is shocked at first sight of his deformity. It's a legitimately heartbreaking scene. This little love story going on here between Daniel and Ilana is just like Quasimodo and the gypsy girl Esmeralda in Hunchback of Notre Dame. Daniel swings around like a monkey, similar to the athletic nature of the original Hunchback of Notre Dame from 1923, starring Lon Chaney Sr. It's as if they were trying to throw in another famous monster here as a bonus. Daniel is played by J. Carrol Naish. Both him and Lon Chaney Jr. teamed up again in the 1973 shitfest Dracula vs. Frankenstein. Fate would have it, it was the last film for both of them. Niemann explores the remains of the Frankenstein castle and finds the body of the Wolfman and the monster frozen in ice. He thaws them out. The monster is still in a dormant stage, but the Wolfman, Larry Talbot, is alive and pissed off. He wants peace from his werewolfism, which he can only find in death, but Niemann promises him that he can cure him by transplanting his brain into another body. He's made the same promise to Daniel, who no longer wants to be a hunchback, something he's promised him since the opening jail scene. So now he's got two promises to fulfill, but instead focuses his attention on trying to revive the monster and playing a big game of brain swapping. He kidnaps two of his former assistants, Ullman and Strauss, who betrayed him. He plans to put Ullman's brain into the skull of the monster and the brain of the Wolfman into Strauss. According to Niemann, that will make him turn into the Wolfman. So the werewolfism is a disease of the brain. Okay, fine, I can go with that. But he acts as if Strauss would be aware of this happening. No, it would only give Larry Talbot another body to become the Wolfman. It doesn't solve anything for Larry, and what the hell does he plan to do with Strauss's brain? Then he wants to put the monster's brain into Larry's body. What good does that do? It's just like combining the Wolfman and the Frankenstein monster into one. Wolfenstein. Well, we got a love triangle going on here. Ilana is no longer paying any attention to Daniel. Now she likes Larry. Poor Daniel. It's all because he has a hump on his back. He wants Niemann to put his brain in Larry's body, but instead Niemann is committed to having the monster's brain go in there for whatever reason. Daniel tries to warn Ilana that Larry is a werewolf, and she yells at him because she thinks he's jealous. Well, Ilana actually does believe Daniel, and she sympathizes with Larry's werewolf problem. Well then, why did she have to yell at him? She hates the poor guy just because he's a hunchback, but she likes Larry even though he's a werewolf and could possibly kill her. It's just because he's more handsome. What a fucking bitch. I can't wait to see the Wolfman tear out her goddamn throat. Oh yeah, it's happening. Here we go. Larry becomes the Wolfman in the most well-done transformation scene yet. It all builds up to an exciting finale where every one of the main characters is killed off in a row. The Wolfman attacks Ilana just as she shoots him with the silver bullet and they both die together. Daniel mourns her death and blames Niemann. Just as Niemann's finally bringing the monster to life, Daniel decides he's had enough and his boss can go to hell. We only see what Daniel does to Niemann in shadow as the monster unstraps itself from the table. It's a great shot that leaves what happens to our imagination. The monster gets up, picks up Daniel, and throws him through a window where he falls to his death. The monster picks up the crippled body of Niemann, and in this one instance, both look each other in the face. It's as if Boris Karloff and the monster are sharing a special bond. Fitting that he was the one who first gave life to the role. It's a wonderful little beat. It's interesting to see him in the role of the Doctor this time. The monster is played by Glenn Strange, an appropriate name, and he ends up playing the monster in all the movies from here on out, making him and Karloff the only actors to play the monster in 3 consecutive movies. The villagers all show up with their burning torches, as usual. They didn't waste any time, did they? The monster's only been alive for a few minutes. Those villagers, man, they're pros by now. They don't take this monster shit. The monster carries Niemann's body out into the swamp and sinks into quicksand. Karloff, who's had enough of getting his face covered in monster makeup, is now getting covered in mud. And then without pissing away any of the momentum, the movie ends. It's great. For a movie that tries to juggle a bunch of monsters, it's quite good at telling its story. All the characters have wants and desires, with Dr. Niemann being in the center of it all. He's such a great villain because he breaks his promises with everyone, Larry, Daniel, and even Dracula. I would have liked to see him double-cross other Universal monsters. How about he poses as an Egyptian museum curator and resurrects the mummy? Then, when he doesn't need the mummy anymore, he pulls off his bandages. What if it was the Invisible Man? He'd somehow make him turn visible right at the worst possible time. This is the kind of villain that only good old Boris can pull off with such class. I also like the way all the monsters are legitimately killed and in their most appropriate ways. Sunlight for Dracula, a silver bullet for the Wolfman, and Niemann dies together with the monster. The monster and Karloff are one. It's well fitting and could have been the perfect way to end the series. Unfortunately, they had to ruin it. House of Frankenstein was a fitting closure to Universal's monster legacy and brought finality to Dracula, the Wolfman, and the Frankenstein monster. But Universal couldn't leave it alone. The following year, they rushed out House of Dracula, which more or less rehashes the previous films. It's an unnecessary sequel, plain and simple, but for us monster lovers, we'll take it. It stars the three famous monsters again, which makes this the first of the Frankenstein films to not have Frankenstein in the title. And technically Dracula doesn't have a house in it either, but whatever. The film opens with Dracula, again played by John Carradine, entering the home of a doctor. It's a quiet and steady build-up and effectively creepy. Dracula approaches the doctor, Dr. Edelman, and asks for, get this, a cure for his vampirism. Yes, apparently Dracula is bored of blood-sucking and not being able to go out in daylight. He wants a cure. As absurd as that sounds, the doctor agrees because it would be a challenge to medical science. While Edelman's busy talking to Dracula, the friggin' Wolfman shows up too. It's never explained how either of them came back to life. We last saw Dracula turn to bones and the Wolfman shot with a silver bullet, but never, not once, are these incidents ever mentioned. So despite parading itself as a follow-up to the last movie, it's really just another reboot. The only thing that is consistent is that Larry Talbot is tired of being the Wolfman, but this time, rather than trying to die, he's hoping the doctor can cure him. He's in a hurry too, because the full moon is rising. Basically, the secretary has to tell him, sorry Wolfman, the doctor's busy with Dracula at the moment. What is he, the monster doctor? Larry runs out in a panic, goes to the police, and requests to have himself locked in a jail cell. Edelman shows up and, wait a minute, that police officer. Is that Lionel Atwill again? Will that guy ever go away? Anyway, this is a hilarious scene because nobody believes that Larry's a werewolf. They all go through the usual routine of telling him that it's only in his mind, but this is a rare moment when he actually becomes the Wolfman right in front of their faces. That shut them up. Typically, Larry would spend half the movie trying to convince everyone, but here, it's done and over with. The Dracula plotline hits the brakes, and the movie becomes all about the Wolfman for a while. Edelman decides he's going to work on curing Larry and actually explains how his werewolfism works.
Pressure upon certain parts of the brain. When this happens, the glands generate an abnormal supply of certain hormones. In your case, those which bring about the physical transformation which you experience.
That's a serious problem I have with this movie. The werewolf transformation should have been kept supernatural instead of giving it a scientific explanation. Well, it's full moon time, so Larry runs off again. He dives into the ocean and gets washed into a cave. Edelman goes after him and gets attacked by the Wolfman just as the full moon descends. Lucky for him. Then guess what? They find Frankenstein's monster in the mud along with the skeleton of Dr. Niemann. Whoa, hold on here. Up until now, the last movie's been ignored. They don't follow up on what happened to Dracula or the Wolfman, but now they're following up on the monster? So this is like a half reboot, half sequel? Anyway, now Edelman's really got his hands full. He's got Dracula, the Wolfman, and now the Frankenstein monster laying on his table. Like every other scientist, he wants to revive the monster, but for the meantime, he decides against it. One thing I don't understand is why Edelman was familiar with Dracula and the Frankenstein monster, but he didn't believe Larry would turn into a werewolf. Whatever. By the way, Edelman has two female assistants. One of them is a hunchback and has almost nothing to do with the plot. The other is a subtle love interest to Larry, which comes off at pure random. Also, Dracula takes a liking to her, and that's when things take a turning point, because now he wants to remain a vampire. It's my impression that this was Dracula's plan all along, just to get into the doctor's house, since the very first scene shows him staring through a window at the assistant. Edelman is giving Dracula a blood transfusion, which I guess is supposed to make him stop being a vampire, but Dracula reverses the flow of the transfusion and contaminates Edelman. What happens to Edelman isn't exactly clear. At first it's implied that he becomes a vampire, because you can see he has no reflection. but instead he turns into some kind of Jekyll and Hyde character. He switches between good and evil at random. He becomes the main monster of the movie. In fact, for a while, he's the only monster. He kills Dracula by opening his coffin, exposing him to sunlight. How anticlimactic is that? Dracula doesn't even have a chance to wake up and realize what's happening. At least he lasted a bit longer than he did in House of Frankenstein. As for the Wolfman, Edelman performs a surgical operation on his brain and cures him, and the Frankenstein monster is still lying on the table. So for now, all we have is the mad Edelman running around terrorizing people. The good news is that he's really fun to watch. There's a very creepy moment where he scares a coach driver and you're kept in suspense waiting for him to kill the guy. Had it not been for the overacting of the coach driver, this would be one of the most effective scenes in the whole Universal catalog. It could have been as suspenseful as the scene with the madman's soul in the old dark house. After he kills the driver, he's chased by the villagers through the town. It heavily borrows from the scene in Nosferatu, where Renfield is being chased. The way they both climb on their roofs draws a strong comparison. The shot of Edelman's shadow growing larger is reminiscent of German expressionist photography. In the end, Larry steps out into the light of the full moon and confirms that he is no longer a werewolf. I have to say, I really like the Silver Bullet better. Having him cured is a disappointing way to end the Wolfman, but on the other hand, it's nice to see a happy ending after all he's suffered through. With only a few minutes left of the film, Edelman finally revives the Frankenstein monster and everything is wrapped up faster than you can say what the shit. Larry shoots Edelman and the monster staggers about destroying the lab. Stuff explodes and catches fire, and next thing you know, you're watching the same ending from Ghost of Frankenstein. Literally, they recycled the same footage, one of Universal's cheapest and shameless moments. So the monster burns to death again, and that's the end. House of Dracula does have its good moments, like all those creepy shots involving shadows, but the plot is uninspired, the ending is a complete letdown, and all three monsters get shortchanged. It is by far, without any doubt, the weakest entry in the series. In the early 1940s, Universal was coming out with a Frankenstein movie almost every year. By the mid-40s, they ran out of steam, and audience didn't find the monsters as scary anymore compared to the real horrors of World War II. So comedians Bud Abbott and Lou Costello gave them a reason for one more outing. Many don't consider this part of the official Frankenstein series because it's a comedy, but I say screw it, I'll include this anyway. The title has a good ring, but is a little odd. Abbott and Costello meet Frankenstein. Well, they meet the Wolfman, Dracula, and the Frankenstein monster, but there is no Dr. Frankenstein anywhere in the film. So they are very explicitly calling the monster by the name that he's been so misidentified with. In the movie, they call him Frankenstein's monster, or the Frankenstein monster, but it's Costello who adds to the mix-up by calling him Frankie. So what is this? The monster is not... You know what? Fuck it. It's Frankenstein. Abbott and Costello play Chick and Wilbur, two baggage clerks who are responsible for transporting the bodies of Dracula and Frankenstein to a Chamber of Horrors exhibit. Dracula wakes up, hypnotizes Wilbur, and revives Frankenstein. Yeah, I'm calling him Frankenstein now. If you can't beat him, join him. Dracula's played by Bela Lugosi for his second and only other time in the movies. It's true that he played Dracula on stage several times. He played Dracula in a short newsreel clip called Hollywood on Parade, where he meets Betty Boop.
You have booped your last boop.
And in a 1950s TV show, You Asked For It. He played other vampires in Mark of the Vampire and Return of the Vampire. But other than that, there were no more Dracula movies featuring Lugosi, so this marked his one and only comeback to the role. Unlike the first Dracula, here you actually see him turn into a bat, with cartoon animation done by the creator of Woody Woodpecker, Walter Lands, whose studio also did the opening cartoon credit sequence. The rule that a vampire casts no reflection in a mirror is ignored here. Everyone regards this as a flub, but it's way too obvious. I think it's just because they didn't establish the lore here. In this movie, he does cast a reflection. The plot is nothing new. It's the same old brain-swapping game. Dracula wants to put Wilbur's brain into Frankenstein with the help of his female assistant who pretends to be Wilbur's girlfriend. Why the hell they want to do this, I have no idea. Larry Talbot shows up and says he's been following the monsters from Europe and that he needs Chick and Wilbur's help to put a stop to them. Chick doesn't believe in monsters and thinks he's crazy. Furthermore, Larry tries to warn them that he turns into a werewolf on every full moon. Needless to say, we aren't following any continuity here. There's no mention of his cure from House of Dracula. Lon Chaney Jr. plays the part with the same level of seriousness as before, and seeing him clash with the comedic joking nature of Costello is a hilarious contrast. I like how the monsters don't try to be funny. They don't act any different than they normally would, so they're the straight men to the comedy. It all clicks together perfectly. A lot of the comedy stems from ignorance. There's a scene where Wilbur is in a hotel room being stalked by the Wolfman, and he has no clue. Then there's all these scenes where Wilbur's trying to convince Chick that he's seeing monsters, but Chick never believes him. It's not their funniest movie, not even close. Abbott and Costello are at their best when they're exchanging fast, witty dialogue. But here, with all the monsters and everything going on, there's not a whole lot of room for them to play around. The finale is lots of fun. Wilbur's strapped to a table while all hell breaks loose around him. The monster goes berserk, and the Wolfman and Dracula fight. The way the monsters are killed is a complete joke. The Wolfman and Dracula fall into the water, which is no different to when Larry dove into the water in House of Dracula. As for Frankenstein, he walks onto a burning dock, and for the first time in his life, he doesn't seem to be afraid of fire, and then he falls through the dock about 2 feet into the water. Nice conclusion. The monster's last movie, and that's how they all die. I read a fact on Wikipedia, and I use the word fact very loosely, but supposedly the Australian film censors required every scene involving a monster to be removed. I guess that version's known as Abbott and Costello Meet Nothing. The Invisible Man makes a last-minute cameo, voiced by Vincent Price. This opened the door for the boys to meet more monsters. There is Abbott and Costello Meet the Killer Boris Karloff, Abbott and Costello Meet Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which features Karloff as the title role, and features the Frankenstein monster, at least a mechanical version. And then there's my favorite, Abbott and Costello Meet the Invisible Man. There's a lot more breathing time for Bud and Lou to go over their sketch gags, and there's a really funny scene where Lou has a boxing match with the Invisible Man in the ring helping him out. It's comedic gold. There's also Abbott and Costello Meet the Mummy, and a short film where they meet the creature from the Black Lagoon. Well, this concludes my in-depth look at the Frankenstein series. Check in tomorrow, I'm going to jump ahead and take a look at another series.